So, in 1776, the ink on the Declaration of Independence wasn't even dry before the very people who wrote it started, well, violating its core premise.
Yeah, immediately.
Right. Imagine drafting the blueprint for this perfect enduring house while intentionally setting the foundation on fire. Or, better yet, think of it like releasing an open source software code. It shipped with this brilliant, revolutionary operating system, but it also contained these massive, fatal bugs regarding fundamental human rights.
Exactly. And instead of the system just crashing permanently, the creators included a patch system, the amendment process,
Right.
which essentially forced the users to fix the code themselves generation after generation.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Whether you are prepping for a civic debate, trying to make sense of your news feed, or you're just insanely curious, our mission today is to shortcut your way to being incredibly well informed about the American project.
Yes, and we have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're pulling all of this from an exhaustive 300-page book by Professor Dr. Milton Biswas. It's called America at 250: Freedom, Power, and the Enduring Democratic Experiment. And our goal today is to prove a concept that the author argues passionately for.
Which is that democracy survives because it is constantly tested, not in spite of it.
Exactly. For you listening, we are going to see how the historical tug-of-war between freedom and institutional power directly shapes the reality you navigate every single day.
And what's fascinating here is how the book completely refuses to give in to either blind triumph or absolute cynicism.
Yeah, he walks a really tight line.
He does. The author argues that American identity is built entirely on the friction between these grand, soaring philosophical ideals and some very stark, often painful historical realities. It requires holding those two opposing truths at the exact same time.
Without letting one cancel the other out.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this by going right back to the Genesis. Because to understand the current moment you and I are living in, we have to understand the intellectual spark that started it all and those immediate glaring contradictions of the 1776 founding.
The crucible, yeah.
Right. We all know the basics of the revolution, but this wasn't just like a tax dispute over tea. This was a massive philosophical shift in human history.
It was a radical intellectual pivot. I mean, it was fueled by Enlightenment thinkers. You have John Locke arguing against the divine right of kings.
Which was the default everywhere, right?
Absolutely. For centuries, the global operating system was simply that God chose the monarch, and the monarch literally owned the people. Locke introduces this explosive idea that political authority actually flows from the bottom up.
The consent of the governed.
Exactly. That it only exists through their consent. Then you add Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing about democratic sovereignty and the general will, and Montesquieu advocating for a strict separation of powers.
So no single branch of government could mutate into a tyranny.
Right. These ideas were basically political dynamite being shipped across the Atlantic.
And that dynamite eventually detonates in Boston, but the book points out something really crucial about the Boston Tea Party. It's often reduced in pop culture to, like, a chaotic riot or just wanton vandalism.
A bunch of guys just throwing things in the harbor.
Yeah, exactly. But Dr. Biswas frames it entirely differently. It was a highly calculated, targeted strike on the economic engine of the British Empire. It was political theater, designed specifically to prove a philosophical point about representation and unjust taxation.
Forcing the crown to either back down or overreact.
Right, and they overreacted.
They did. And that pushed the colonies to break away and draft the Declaration of Independence. They boldly claimed that all men are created equal. Yet the moment they attempted to govern, they ran headfirst into the contradictions of their own reality.
Because freedom at the founding wasn't universal.
No, not at all. The author describes it as a contested terrain.
And I get stuck here, honestly. We revere these framers as political geniuses, but they literally codified human bondage. How does the author reconcile that? I mean, you have the paradox of the 35th Compromise embedded right into the Constitution.
Yeah, artificially inflating the political power of the South.
Exactly, by counting enslaved people as fractions of a person for representation while giving them zero human rights. Plus, you have the violent displacement of indigenous nations, and you have the total exclusion of women through the laws of coverture.
Which is such a vital point. Coverture is a perfect example of a foundational bug in that early source code.
Can you explain coverture really quickly?
Sure. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was entirely absorbed by her husband upon marriage. She was literally covered.
Wow.
She couldn't own property, she couldn't sign a contract, or even keep her own wages.
Hmm.
Her legal existence essentially vanished the moment she got married.
So, I mean, I have to ask, were the founders just hypocrites? Or were they building a system they knew future generations would just have to dismantle and fix?
Well, the historical analysis suggests it was a deeply tragic mixture of political expedience and the profound moral failure of their specific era.
Okay.
They compromised on human lives and basic dignity just to forge this fragile, temporary national consensus between the agrarian South and the mercantile North.
It's like a high-stakes game of Jenga.
Right. But the remarkable part of the design is that the Constitution wasn't meant to be static. It was the codification of a continuing dialogue. By embedding mechanisms for amendment, they built a framework that allowed future generations to fight for the rights that were intentionally left out.
But, an open source code with fatal bugs eventually crashes. A Jenga tower with missing blocks can't stand forever. Those founding contradictions inevitably led to a massive physical and moral rupture, the Civil War.
Yeah, by the 1850s, that fragile initial compromise was unraveling completely. And the book points out a technological accelerant here that completely shifted the landscape.
The telegraph.
The telegraph, yes.
It's fascinating because it acted almost exactly like the social media of the 19th century.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
Think about the mechanism of news before 1844. Information traveled at the speed of a horse or a ship.
Right.
If a politician gave a polarizing, fiery speech in Washington defending or attacking slavery, it might take weeks to reach the public in the Western territories.
There was a built-in cooling-off period.
Exactly. The telegraph stripped away that cooling-off period entirely. Now, inflammatory rhetoric was spreading nationwide in a matter of hours. It accelerated the cultural divide over slavery, pushing public outrage to a boiling point far faster than the political system could manage.
So the geographical and ideological divide just hardened into an outright physical fracture.
Yes.
And the human toll of that fracture was just unfathomable. Over 600,000 dead.
Yeah.
The book highlights cultural artifacts from that era, like Walt Whitman's poetry collection, Drum Taps.
Oh, yeah.
Whitman volunteered as a nurse in the army hospitals, and his writing doesn't just glorify the battles. It captures the paradox of immense heroism alongside absolute bloody horror. He humanized the soldiers, showing a nation literally bleeding out over the contradictions of its own founding documents.
And out of that immense bloodshed came Reconstruction, which the author frames as a moment of incredible, radical promise. We see the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
And these weren't minor tweaks.
No, not at all. This was an attempt to rewrite the nation's DNA, abolishing slavery, establishing birthright citizenship, and guaranteeing the right to vote for black men. You have the Freedmen's Bureau actively setting up schools and negotiating labor contracts.
To protect newly freed individuals.
Right. You even see the election of black representatives to the U.S. Senate, like Hiram Revels. It was a tangible, rapid attempt to forge a true multiracial democracy.
But then comes the perilous rollback. The constitutional amendments are passed, but the reality on the ground violently snaps back. We see the rise of the KKK utilizing localized terror. We see the implementation of black codes,
which were incredibly insidious.
Let's clarify how insidious they were. They didn't just casually strip away rights. They used the legal system to essentially recreate the conditions of slavery. If a newly freed black man couldn't prove he was employed by a white planter, he could be arrested under vagrancy laws.
And his labor would be auctioned off to the highest bidder.
Exactly. Plus, you have the creation of the Lost Cause myth, which was this deliberate cultural campaign to romantically rewrite the history of the Confederacy and uphold white supremacy. So, how does this happen? If Reconstruction had such massive, undeniable legislative wins on paper, why did it unravel so quickly? Was it just Northern political fatigue?
Well, this raises an important question about the stark limits of the law itself. There is a vast, complicated gap between passing legislation in the Capitol and actually remaking the deeply held prejudices, social hierarchies, and economic realities of a population.
Passing a law doesn't change hearts and minds.
Right. Emancipation wasn't a single event finalized by a signature. It was a grueling, violently contested process. The legal code changed, but the economic power dynamics in the South largely did not.
Because the land and the wealth were still controlled by the same people.
Exactly, and because the economic dependency remained, It allowed those old hierarchies to weaponize local law enforcement and domestic terror to reassert themselves.
So if the Civil War era was about breaking physical chains and attempting to rewrite the constitutional code, the next era forces us to look at economic chains because from the ashes of the Civil War, America rebuilt itself through sheer unprecedented industry.
The Gilded Age.
Right. And that birthed massive new wealth, but also an entirely new structural power imbalance. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you look at these industrial titans who built the modern infrastructure of the country, but wielded power that often eclipsed the federal government itself.
Yeah, you have Andrew Carnegie mastering vertical integration in the steel industry.
He didn't just own the steel mills.
No, he bought the iron mines to extract the ore and the railroads to transport it. He controlled the entire supply chain, which allowed him to crush competitors. But it also led to violent clashes with his workers, most notably during the Homestead Strike.
And on the other side, you have John D. Rockefeller utilizing horizontal integration to build the Standard Oil monopoly.
And Rockefeller's mechanism was different, but equally ruthless. He bought out rival oil refineries, but he also leveraged his sheer size to negotiate secret, deeply discounted rebates with the railroads,
So his competitors had to pay higher shipping rates.
making it mathematically impossible for them to compete. He essentially cornered the market, alongside figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled the very arteries of American capitalism, the railroads themselves.
When you look at the sheer structural dominance of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt, it's impossible not to draw a direct line to today's tech monopolies.
Oh, the parallels are striking.
Right. You have these brilliant, ruthless visionaries who are quite literally building the infrastructure of the future, but they hold immense unregulated power. When one person controls the oil or the steel or today the data algorithms, it fundamentally threatens the basic democratic concept of fairness.
And extreme inequality always acts as a catalyst for grassroots pushback.
Right.
The sheer brutality of industrial capitalism forced marginalized voices to test the democratic experiment again.
The progressive movements rise up.
Exactly. They demand that the government regulate the free market. You see Jane Addams founding Hull House in Chicago to provide direct social services to exploited immigrant communities.
Yeah.
You see the American Federation of Labor fighting for basic human dignity, like the 8-hour workday.
And sometimes that change only comes through unimaginable tragedy. The book points to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911.
Such a horrific event.
146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, burned to death or jumped from windows because management had literally locked the exit doors to prevent them from taking unauthorized breaks. The public shock from that specific horror was the mechanism that finally galvanized massive systemic pushes for workplace safety laws.
And it fueled the early women's movement, too. The author draws a brilliant through line from these Gilded Age labor battles directly into the monumental social movements of the 20th century. The friction between grassroots masses demanding justice and institutional power, trying to maintain the status quo that becomes the primary engine of democratic progress.
And the book proves that by showing how these later movements were inherently intersectional. We see the civil rights movement, driven not just by towering figures like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., but by grassroots organizers like Ella Baker and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
We understood that you couldn't just fight for a seat at the lunch counter.
Right, you had to fight for voting rights and economic equity simultaneously. Then you have the feminist movement, ignited by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, laying bare the psychological trap of post-war domesticity.
And the LGBTQ plus liberation movement kicking into high gear when patrons at the Stonewall Inn finally fought back against routine, violent police raids.
So the mechanism of change in all these instances is friction.
Yes. Democracy's vitality relies on the tension generated when the marginalized force the institution to live up to its own stated ideals. It's the people demanding that the missing patches of the constitutional code finally be installed.
So if the physical monopolies of the Gilded Age forced us to rewrite the rules of fair play regarding labor and capital, what happens when the monopoly isn't physical steel or oil, but the very information we consume? That brings us to the modern stress test.
Wow.
The digital revolution has created a volatile, entirely new battlefield for American democracy.
It really has. The book dives deeply into the contemporary digital public sphere, particularly focusing on the Trump era. Platforms like Twitter fundamentally changed political communication.
Because they allowed politicians to bypass traditional media gatekeepers.
Exactly. The editors and journalists who historically filtered the news. This created a direct, highly intimate line from the politician to the public.
I want to pause here really quickly, because what I really appreciate about Dr. Biswas's book is how incredibly clinical his analysis is on this topic. And for you listening, I want to be perfectly clear, we are impartially reporting on this historical analysis. We are not taking a left-wing or right-wing stance on any of this. The author looks at grassroots activism on the left and populist movements on the right, strictly as symptoms of the exact same underlying condition, a polarized digital age.
Yes, analytically speaking, this era saw the total weaponization of the information ecosystem. And the book makes a crucial distinction here regarding the mechanics of false information.
Misinformation versus disinformation.
Right. Misinformation is false info shared without the intent to deceive. It's a well-meaning relative sharing a fabricated article because they genuinely think it's true. Disinformation, however, is deliberately, strategically fabricated to deceive, manipulate, and sow chaos.
And the algorithms that govern our social media feeds don't care about the difference between the two, right? They just care about engagement.
They optimize for time on site.
Right.
And psychologically, nothing keeps human beings glued to a screen longer than moral outrage.
Wow.
These algorithms feed on disinformation, creating digital echo chambers where people are entirely insulated from dissenting views. When you never see the other side's argument, the opposition stops being a fellow citizen with a different opinion and becomes an existential enemy. It degrades our shared reality.
And we saw this dual nature of digital tools play out dramatically. On one hand, the digital age is a tool for massive, unprecedented mobilization. Grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter utilize these platforms to demand systemic accountability for police violence, organizing global protests in a matter of hours.
And climate activists, like the Sunrise Movement, use the exact same digital infrastructure to push for urgent environmental policy changes.
And on the other side of the political spectrum, we saw digital mobilization culminate in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which the author views as a literal physical stress test of democratic resilience.
A moment where online disinformation regarding election integrity spilled out of the digital echo chamber and into physical institutional violence, testing the actual mechanisms of the peaceful transfer of power.
But I have to ask, isn't this just the modern equivalent of the printing press? When the printing press was invented, it shattered the information monopoly of the church and caused massive, bloody religious and political wars across Europe for centuries. So is social media fundamentally breaking our brains and destroying our democracy? Or is it just a deeply disruptive communication tool that we simply haven't learned how to regulate yet?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you've hit on the ultimate paradox of this era. Yes, algorithmic polarization and digital echo chambers have severely fractured our national discourse and eroded civic trust to dangerous levels.
Right.
But simultaneously, this exact same period of intense digital friction has spurred record-breaking voter turnout and incredibly vibrant, widespread civic engagement across the entire political spectrum.
That's a really good point.
It is highly disruptive, yes,
Right.
but it means the populace is fiercely engaged. The system is under massive strain, but it is undeniably alive.
Which means we have to figure out how to manage that strain. We have to look forward. How does the American ecosystem mutate and adapt to survive this digital stress test and make it to its 500th anniversary?
Well, the author outlines several horizons ahead that will test that adaptability. First, the technological frontiers, artificial intelligence and biotechnology, like CRISPR gene editing. These aren't just fascinating tech developments, they are profound ethical and democratic challenges.
Right, because if an AI algorithm is making decisions about who gets approved for a mortgage or who gets flagged in the criminal justice system, and that AI is trained on historically biased data, it just automates and scales discrimination at light speed.
Precisely the danger. And with biotechnology, we are forced to ask who gets access to life-extending therapies. If only the ultra-wealthy can afford gene editing to cure diseases, wealth inequality literally becomes biological inequality.
That is terrifying. The book also tackles the existential threat of climate change, emphasizing the absolute necessity of global cooperation. And the mechanism for addressing this is fascinating. The author heavily references the integration of indigenous stewardship models.
Yes, instead of relying solely on industrial extraction.
Right, and trying to just engineer our way out of the crisis, the book suggests we must learn from indigenous cultures that have successfully practiced sustainable intergenerational land management for millennia.
And to manage all of these compounding crises, the book argues for civic reinvention and democratic flexibility. We need structural reforms to make the machinery of governance more resilient. The author specifically points to ranked choice voting as a mechanical fix for polarization.
I love the mechanics of ranked choice voting. Right now, in a traditional primary system, candidates often have to pander to the most extreme vocal fringes of their base just to survive.
Exactly.
Ranked choice voting completely changes the mathematical incentives. You vote for your favorite candidate, but you also rank your second and third choices. If no one gets a majority, the lowest vote getter is eliminated, and their votes roll over. It mathematically forces politicians to appeal to a broader coalition because being someone's acceptable second choice is suddenly incredibly valuable.
The book also champions participatory budgeting, where citizens have direct, granular input on how local public funds are spent, rather than just voting for a representative and hoping for the best.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And fundamentally, the author argues we need a massive overhaul in education to prioritize media literacy. We have to give citizens the cognitive tools they actually need to navigate a weaponized digital information landscape safely.
It makes me think of the analogy we started with. We aren't dealing with a static blueprint or a rigid house at all. America's democracy is a living, evolving ecosystem, and ecosystems have to mutate and adapt to survive in new environments. If they don't adapt to the changing climate, whether that climate is technological, political, or literal, they die.
The author emphasizes that all this structural innovation has to be partnered with moral courage and ethical stewardship. Democracy is inherently an unfinished project.
It's never done.
No, never. Managing these future horizons, ensuring that hyper-advanced technology and shifting climate policies actually serve human dignity and equity, that is the ultimate act of patriotism. It's about being an active, critical participant in that ecosystem.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with an Enlightenment source code in 1776 that was brilliant but deeply flawed, wobbling under the weight of its own intentional contradictions. We examined the mechanism of the telegraph accelerating the literal fires of the Civil War.
We saw how the structural monopolies of the industrial age forced workers to rewrite the rules.
Right, and we traced the intersectional social movements of the 20th century all the way to the algorithmic echo chambers and intense polarization of today. For you listening, the core takeaway from Professor Biswas's work is that democracy is an active verb. It is not a spectator sport. It requires your daily participation, your media literacy, and your willingness to engage with perspectives you might inherently disagree with.
The system only functions if the citizens are willing to do the continuous work of patching the code.
So what does this all mean? Where does this leave us as we look toward the next 250 years of the American experiment?
I want to leave you with a thought that builds directly on the author's work, something to really chew on as you go about your day. If digital platforms and engagement algorithms now mediate our democracy and construct our shared reality more than physical town halls or newspapers ever did, will the Constitution of America's next 250 years need an entirely new amendment? Will we need to explicitly guarantee cognitive liberty, a fundamental constitutional right to an unmanipulated digital reality?
Wow, a constitutional right to your own unhacked mind, that is something to think about. Because if the ecosystem you are living in is being artificially altered by an algorithm designed to keep you outraged, the original source code doesn't matter at all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we will catch you next time.